war, but a realm of pure psychic energy, a reflection of our thoughts and feelings made manifest. Its influence is not bound to the confines of one universe, but is spread wide among the ever-diverging tracks of the multiverse. This is one such track, the Angel Apostasy.
Ding, 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 the anvil cried out beneath Nibel's hammer blows on white-hot metal. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a rag from his back pocket and lifted his face to be cooled by the night wind from a large workshop window. He raised his hammer to begin again when something caught in his peripheral vision. He replaced the metal in the crackling flames and walked to the window. Squinting, he saw movement. Shooting stars were common on Nocturne, but this was different. A second later, the coin dropped. It was getting larger. He scrambled out of his workshop, prepared for the worst, when it screeched overhead. He twisted around, following it with his eyes as it crested over the southern hill, followed shortly by an explosion. Nibel was spared his workshop by a matter of meters, but what he had gained of momentary solace in the protection of his property, he had lost magnitudes over in not only the well-being of his world, but his galaxy at large. This is due to the fate of the being crash-landing from the sky above. What would have been a savior and champion of the common man in an uncaring galaxy would become one of their most devastating terrors. The difference between angel and demon is only a few meters in the warp. Nibel trudged over the hill, a weapon of his own creation in hand. He saw a black and deep scoop carved out of the base on the next hill. The earth of the crater had superheated to glass and begun to fracture. Rivulets of magma pushed their way out through the glass. The hill was one tendril of the countless veins of Nocturne's lifeblood bulging across the crust. Nibel slowly walked towards it. He could see some shimmering pearl in the center, but couldn't make it out. As he made his way, the magma accelerated its pace, churning out molten rock in slowly growing, pulsating dollops, quickly filling the crater around the object. He got close enough to make out that it was a pod of some kind, and that is when he heard it. Fizzes and pops as seals burnt off, and the strained groan of metal warping, giving way to the heat and pressure. Then, over all the noise, a child's wail, one louder and deeper than any he had heard, but distinctly a child nonetheless. Soon it wrenched deeper and contorted to an inhuman howl of agony. He got closer and the scene became clear. The pod, half submerged, and a child, whose flesh, where not coated in liquid rock, was alight in white flame. The boy was not dense enough to be fully engulfed, and so dragged himself across the mass of magma. Nibel, as hard as any man of this hell-forged world, threw up on the spot. The horrid sounds were rending his mind, and the sight of flesh melting and regrowing only to melt again was too much for his stomach to bear. The child grew closer and he snapped back into the moment. With a panicked frenzy, he looked for something to grab him with. Armed with nothing but his weapon and his blacksmithing garb, he resolved to make do. The child screamed and crawled his way towards Nibel, who was kneeling, waiting for the boy, careful to place his thick blacksmithing smock over his knee and steel-toed boot. As the child approached, he saw heavier globs of cooling rock slide off the boy, taking flesh with it. He embraced Nibel's leg, leather searing and beginning to smoke. Nibel used his weapon to pry and cut away as much rock off the boy as he could manage, all the while his eardrums rang with deafening cries. The boy squeezed with strength that belied his size, but Nibel continued through the audible pops from his legs with gritted teeth. Nibel's knuckles whitened around his weapon as bone began to fissure. Working through the pain, he breathed through his nose, ignoring the acrid smoke and smell of burnt flesh coming from the molten rock trapped between his leg and the boy. Despite his ravaged leg, he managed to remove all of the rock. Biting his lip until the sharp taste of copper filled his mouth, he hoisted the boy in his arms, putting all of his weight in his one good leg. He nearly buckled under the weight. The child was like bundled steel wrapped in flesh. Steadying himself, he breathed the slow, practiced breaths he was taught to manage the pain of a forge burn. Doing so, he thought of the state the boy must be in and examined him. Unfortunately, to Nibel it appeared the boy's skin had been charred from the burns. He'd seen it before from unwary novitiate smiths, but this was far worse, coal-blackened but rough and cracked like desert earth. Nibel chalked it up to the stones fusing with the healing flesh. The boy's skin otherwise was a miracle, regenerating as fast as it melted. Eyes as red as the magma which birthed him met Nibel's in the rare calms between shrieks of agony. Nibel was taken aback. There was pain in there, but no fear. While that unnerved him, what really scared him was that the child wasn't looking at him, but studying him the way he studied wrought iron before working it. He looked right through him, weighed his entire being in a moment, and found where it was wanting. He pulled the boy close and told himself that he would worry about it later. For now, he limped home with a smoldering, screaming child in his arms. The next day came, and Nibel brought the child to the settlement's council, telling the tale of descent, trial, and rejuvenation. The wise men of the council immediately recognized the child as the long-prophesied savior, a liberator who would free his people from the Eldar, Xeno-raiders who ravaged them for as long as their recorded history. They tasked Nibel as his guardian and main tutor, as he was chosen by the gods to find him. Standing with weight on his makeshift iron cane, he looked to the crowd and then to the boy and said, "I shall accept this honorable task, and the boy, I shall name him Vulcan, after the first king of the salamanders." With that, the council stood and cheered, deliverance finally at hand. Vulcan, however, stood there phlegmatic, and that is how he would remain as he excelled in nearly everything he did. His prodigious skill kept pace with the astonishing growth of his body. Nibel taught him all he knew, Vulcan grasping the concepts immediately and intuiting their use in all manner of unexpected ways. Nibel was not alone in his tutelage of Vulcan. Others from the settlement would come and impart their wisdom onto the boy. It was these sessions where the rare event of Vulcan struggling would occur. He would be taught a concept, nod as he usually would, taking in the information and applying it across the vast web of his understanding, but instead of immediately proving his mastery of it, he would just sit there and grimace, his face contorting as if in severe pain. Leanis, his music teacher, made the fatal error of confusing this quirk with laziness and rapped him on the head with his music sheet, as he would any other student. In a reflexive burst of anger, Vulcan backhanded the man, smashing the instrument to pieces and caving in his face. Vulcan stood over the man's corpse, eyes wide, chest heaving with labored breaths, and hands shaking with barely contained wrath rather than exertion. Nibel saw it from the doorway and waited until the storm had abated to confront him. Vulcan apologized and looked disturbed at the damage he inflicted, but when he tried to explain it, he was at a loss for words and just held his head. Nibel nodded and helped the boy to his room. Vulcan was only 2 years old, but as tall as he. He placated the horrified council with words of accident and prophecy. After that, Vulcan, while still venerated, was held at arm's length by the rest of the settlement, unsure when he may erupt again. Other tutors came less and less after that, and were heavily wary of Vulcan's paroxysms. It was the 4th year of Vulcan's time with the settlement. He was the largest man by half, and his skill had surpassed that of Nibel's. Roles reversed, he had begun giving daily lessons of new metalworking techniques and sharing the newfound secrets of the minerals of Nocturne. Dusk had begun to settle, and Nibel was sweeping clear the path from his home to his workshop when a bell rang throughout the settlement. Nibel dropped his broom and shouted, "Vulcan, we have to go. The shelter's not far."
"No,"
boomed Vulcan from within the workshop.
"I shall hide from no one. Eldar blood will flow today,"
Vulcan said, stepping out of his workshop. He stood shirtless, a leather smock folded around his waist, holding a mastercraft weapon in each hand. His accident had freed him from the constant attention and distractions of his people, leaving him to meditate on the more productive, long-term solutions to their problems. Nibel pleaded, but Vulcan just placed a hand on his shoulder, and before walking past, he said,
"If you are not willing to risk your life to defend you and yours, how can you call yourselves anything other than willing slaves?"
Nibel went to the council, and the wise men met Vulcan in the town square. People unable to find better sanctuary hid around the place, in nearby houses, storage sheds, and even stalls. The wise men pleaded for him to wait, to hide, to see reason. One raised his hand up and gestured around the cowering people and asked, "Please, if not for yourself, hide, so that you may one day better defend the weak." Vulcan just stared out to the edge of town for a few moments, taking in their protestations, before burning embers turned their way, silencing them to a man. He merely shook his head slowly. The wise men faltered, knowing he was set but unwilling to leave him alone. Vulcan spoke, loud enough for the whole town square to hear.
"You speak of one day. What of those today? No. I accept the responsibility of the free man for a free people. If you cannot fight, go and I will bleed for you, as is the burden of the strong. But know that they will only stop when we stop them.
They wavered for a second, but left. A few minutes later, they were replaced by twice the amount of fighting-age men and a few older boys. Not as many as Vulcan knew were in the settlement, however, his disposition even now keeping away all but the most hardy. But those who stood behind him, rallied by his words, were ready to defend their home at any cost. He nodded and spoke his last words to the people hiding.
There is no shame in being weak, only staying so. Remember, your people will bleed today, so you may return the favor tomorrow.
A few moments after the last of the men showed up, Vulcan's head snapped towards the edge of the settlement. He hoisted an enormous war maul onto his shoulder and pointed a sturdy war axe, inlaid with an intricate pattern of brass to form a dragon's maw opening to the blade's edge.
Ready yourselves, they come,
Vulcan said before settling into a reactive position. The human defenders heard them before they saw them, howling mixed with cruel laughter and jeers from sharp alien tongues. Bolts shot at them from a distance, not to hit, instead to make them flee like game to be run down. But Vulcan did not move, and so held firm the resolve of his men. A floating barge flew towards them, gliding over the ground. The sounds intensified as they rushed forward, almost a weapon in and of itself. But Vulcan stood, unyielding as a statue, bolts whizzing past his face. An Eldar with crimson-red hair whipping behind her held on to the port bow of the ship, leveling a wicked lance to score first blood. Vulcan held still until the barge was directly upon him. He sprung, bringing down his hammer to the tip of the barge. It crumbled beneath his blow, the inertia flinging the back of the barge upward. In one swift motion, Vulcan followed through using his momentum. He twisted his body around the falling lance, and the red-headed Eldar's lightning-fast reflexes kicked in just soon enough for a shocked face to raise and meet Vulcan's as he brought his axe around for a backhanded bisecting swing. The wet and meaty bouncing of the body was drowned out by the upside-down barge screeching to a halt behind Vulcan. A bearded man of the settlement crushed the head of the gunner, pinned down by the barge. Another, looking inside the overturned vehicle, was met with a razor-thin blade plunged up beneath his chin before 3 other men fell upon the last Eldar, stabbing and kicking it to death. A pattern began to form as bands of seemingly independent Eldar repeatedly rushed headlong to their death, too arrogant to believe that some trifling Monkey, their apparent name for humans, could possibly resist them. Each passing wave, Vulcan became swifter, more adept in anticipating the Eldar's movements and taking each band in one set of powerful swings. By the midway point of this impromptu war of attrition, the settlement dwellers stopped taking losses altogether, and by the end, it was a rare occurrence for someone other than Vulcan to engage the Eldar at all. By the dawn, it had been an hour since the last raid. The only sound was Vulcan's heavy breathing, and his axe's ornaments jingling and shaking hands, signaling all present to give him space. Finally moving, he squeezed the leather grip of his weapons and shot both arms in the air, roaring. Men followed suit with roars and cheers until it all merged into a single repetition.
Vulcan, Vulcan, Vulcan.
Vulcan turned and fell to one knee. The men's reactions turned to concern, wondering if the giant's constitution had finally given way to exhaustion. Vulcan's eyes slowly traveled across the collection of men, making sure to lock and hold every man's eyes for a second, and said,
Each one of you found the courage and strength to risk your lives to save those of your friends and family. This is as much your victory as mine. For the people, for Nocturne.
Nocturne, Nocturne, Nocturne.
They erupted once more. Many years later, Vulcan stood in his quarters aboard the flagship of his newly rejoined legion, the Flamerot, a Gloriana-class battleship. He stared at a wall-sized pick screen made to look as a viewport to the outside of the ship. He had experienced much in such little time. Shock still rang within him from the revelation of his true origins, reuniting with his father, and meeting his sons. Despite this, his mind was drawn elsewhere. He dwelled on the events of the contest with his father to the point of simmering rage, although his face would never show it. A hunt for the largest salamander they could find, only using weapons crafted in a day and a night. But the indignity of being crowned the winner, despite seeing him sacrifice his larger salamander to save his life, burnt in his chest, leaving a flaming lump of coal in his throat. He His rational mind knew that this was foolish, of course, but the pain of being helpless irradiated out from the very core of his being, consuming him. So, when the news that an Eldar Corsair fleet was ravaging his home, Vulkan became a maelstrom of emotions. He was disappointed and horrified that they were not only not deterred, but back ravaging his people. He was incensed that they had the temerity, the unmitigated gall, to only wait until they had reached as far as the Mandeville point. But worst of all, he was excited at the opportunity to connect with his sons on a first blooding, to replace that nagging feeling with that honorable victory, and rip, tear, and run red the streets of Nocturne with Eldar blood. Vulkan informed the Emperor of his plan, promising to bring his waiting father a gift from the Eldar once he joined him on Terra. With his blessing, they parted ways. Vulkan took the fleet under his command and headed for Nocturne. Prometheus and the orbital platforms were still in early development, so they had left a small portion of their fleet to guard the sector. Unfortunately, they were insufficient as the Eldar ships took them by surprise and were unable to mount a significant defense before they were wiped out. Many of the Eldar ships had left the system after the attack. The majority of the ships still in orbit were either transport ships to take their slave cargo or a small contingency of defensive spacecraft. Using a few merchant ships from the caravan who were perpetually in the Emperor's wake, he lured out the combat ships and struck hard from a near impossible distance with modified Nova cannons of Vulcan's own design. While Vulcan's ship engaged the few survivors of his barrage, he secretly set out the fastest part of his fleet to get within teleportation range. Before the Eldar could disengage to maneuver or get to a safe warp jump distance, tactical Terminator squads teleported aboard their ships. The internals were barely defended, and each squad took minimal losses. The successive masterful victories would boost morale and Vulcan's mood enormously. Unfortunately, they would only last until Vulcan made for the final cleansing of Nocturne itself. It began simple enough. Drop pods shot off to the last known areas of Eldar activity, with Vulcan sent down where the fighting was thickest. It was an echo of his first encounter all those years ago, but this time he had his sons at his side, and the Eldar did not stand a chance. At least, not initially. Vulcan's forces had the element of surprise, taking the Eldar off guard and slaughtering them to a man. When the reinforcements came, it was not like before. No wave after wave of whooping sadists delirious with murder lust. They trickled in, a little at a time, probing the Marines' defenses. Before he knew it, a rapid, well-disciplined force began to overwhelm Vulcan. His men dropped left and right, molecular thin shuriken shearing through ceramite armor as if it were silk. For a time, Vulcan was still getting the better of them on the field, able to systematically bring them closer and closer, first long-range focusing fire limiting their options until they had no choice but to move up. Then he implemented precise area denial with flamers, forcing them up close where he can get personal with his single-handed thunderhammer and vicious power claw, Dragon's Maw. This worked until attrition began to drain Vulcan's force. Too many of his bolters fell, leaving the flamers starved for targets, forcing them to take cover. They were beset on all sides, until, instantaneously, the shots ceased. His men returned fire with their sidearms, but the mass of them rushed in like raving orcs. Confused but seizing this opportunity, he ordered his flamers to fire at will, and he stepped in to take any who managed to slip through. Revelry intermingled with hate as he met the few survivors among the choking smoke and flame. He laughed hard as he turned one Eldar into 5 sloppy falling parts with a single swing of his power claw before he felt a sharp pain in the joints between his left arm. He looked around, unable to see who or what had struck him, but a moment later he felt a new sensation. Wheeziness. He stumbled for a moment, his unmatched healing system somehow unable to fend off this coming fugue. Blackness encircled his vision as a sense of reality diminished to pinpricks in the distance, and the Primarch collapsed. The sound of a whirling blade, followed by the rapid successive clang of metal on metal like a massive cybernetic centipede crawling around him, was the only sensation Vulcan could perceive.
Good. You are awake.
The voice like a dusty hive of emaciated locusts all speaking at once, a chittering echo.
Your resilience is extraordinary.
The voice took its time, savoring each word.
Reversing it and using it against you was a challenge. I needed old tools, bringing you back, waking you. Older tools still, many debts called. You should feel honored.
The last words spoken with bitter venom.
I have considered many ways we could spend our time. I waited just letting you listen for a while. Let your imagination run. But I've always found the culmination of a sensual bounty is greater than the sum of its parts.
With that, Vulcan's vision returned. The experience of it turning on like a switch while his eyes were open unnerved Vulcan in a new way. The feeling of cold around his limbs and across his naked backside was heightened in contrast to the warmth on the top of his skull. His eyes darted around an empty void, the dull illumination on either side the only hint that his sight had returned. He pulled at his bonds to no avail. Even with all his might, the bonds did not budge. That is when a head snapped into existence, upside down only half a meter from his face. The pale skin on the baldness of its scalp was the only real sign of it being an Eldar left. Its eyes, pitted in metal frames, were small black patterns like a Vox speaker, but focusing his vision showed hundreds, if not thousands, of little miniature eyes clustered together. Its nose was a crater but for the metal grate. Those features crowned a massive double set of interlocking downward-pointed mandibles, like two sets of manted hands politely waiting to spring and eviscerate its lunch. Its head pulled back and turned to a body ascending the suggestion of a wall, as if to see Vulcan from a better angle. Whether it was his emperor-given gift of innate engineering design or some hereto unknown natural sense of horrific imagination, Vulcan could not say, but his guess at what he had heard was more correct than he wanted to be. The skin from the Eldar's mandibles traveled down his six-armed torso and continued to an elongated centipede-like body of articulatable metal scythes. It resembled a flesh lab coat, open at the chest revealing hundreds of many moving mini-mechanical arms, with veiny, wrinkled sleeves for each torsoed limb. He twisted and he curled and he ran across the walls as he thought out loud and said,
Oh, the secrets and pleasures we will discover together. It will be orgasmic.
Presumably, the arms ran up and down the sleeves as well, considering items entered and left the hands from within the flesh with apparent indecision.
Oh yes, that shall be our order,
He said, stopping for a second before rushing up to Vulcan and seductively mounting on top of him with a speed that pushed the Primarch's reaction time to its limits. The Eldar presented a syringe from one hand and gently squeezed a drop onto a finger, moaning with ecstasy as it made contact. He dragged his finger from Vulcan's throat to above where his navel ought to be, and with each second dragged on Vulcan's senses like 100 years. The sensation overwhelming, gripping his mind with the detail of each atom of the liquid, of the finger, and their lubed friction grinding on his already abnormally sensitive chest. By the time it finished, the centuries of built-up frustration, helplessness, violation, culminated and erupted. Vulcan frothed from the mouth, eyes budged and impotently pressed against his binds, perfectly suited to not allow any movement.
not the usual reaction, but interesting, very interesting.
The Eldar said as it brandished a molecule-thin blade and slowly lowered it to his chest.
You are going to feel a little prick.
He said, moaning as he began to push the blade in with a coated finger. Vulcan only experienced the very smallest exultation of the upcoming feast of pleasurable pain before it was cut short by a blinding flash of light and the Eldar creature was gone. To Vulcan it had appeared as some sort of melt-a-blast, but far more powerful. He heard tapping followed by a ka-thunk. The binds that held Vulcan had receded into the table, and the cables connected through his skull decompressed and disconnected. Vulcan got up and saw the twitching lower half of the Eldar centipede beneath a crisp shadow on the wall.
Come now. We don't have time. We don't have time at all. We have inconvenienced him, only.
Vulcan turned to see an Eldar twitching over a control panel near the door. His regal clothes were in shocking contrast to the state of his body. Unlike any Eldar he had seen before, he was not pale but sickly pallid, and the beginnings of bloat had begun to creep into his features. Vulcan, naked on the operating table, took a quarter of a second to weigh his options, and then got up and followed the creature. As soon as they left the doorway, the Eldar broke out into a run, somehow even faster than others of his kind, despite his appearances. Vulcan followed with ease, running up narrow corridors with plush carpets which sunk under his feet, and down spiked stairs where hideous malformed monstrosities writhed on the walls and wailed for death in 1,000 tongues. They finally made it to a chamber with a pad on the floor and a screen built into the wall.
Stand there. It will take us to the exit point.
The sickly Eldar said, gesturing to the pad as he started tapping on the screen. He finished and stood next to Vulcan. He reeked of carcass, and Vulcan could feel the foul stench molecules on the sensitive line of his chest. It began to power up as green lights began flashing from the chamber ceiling. Vulcan heard dull thuds in the distance, growing in intensity. The Eldar began to shake, and, despite the lights, turned an even greener shade of sick. As the percussive thrumming became audible to even a mortal human, the flash of a teleport went off, and something was wrong. Vulcan was nauseous. He had teleported with his father before, and there was no similar sickness. His vision was unclear, but it was quickly coming into focus. He saw a purple archway, swirling with soul light of the immaterium.
Yes. Even with the kind gifts, I still wouldn't be fast enough. But with a slight tweak of the teleport parameters, the advantage may be enough.
The vile wretch said from behind him as he managed to gain his senses. He continued.
As promised, this is your way home. Let me help you.
He held Vulcan and walked him to the portal. Vulcan could smell the milieu of halitosis and decay on his tongue as he said,
You see, this is a win-win situation, you see. You get home, and the gifts of love from grandfather, while I finally have freedom from she who thirsts for good.
Vulcan looked down, eyes finally snapping into focus, as he saw a chipped rusty dagger, weeping something that smelled a mixture between the sweetness of rot intertwined with the repulsive, heavy hand of fresh phlegm. Vulcan was a fraction too late. Between the proximity and the unnatural speed of the Eldar, the dagger was in his chest by the time Vulcan's hand was halfway there. He felt the vile roots grow as the venom twisted and turned through his circulatory system. He immediately began to seize. The last thing he remembered was a boot in his back and hurtling through the warp. He landed on a cold stone floor. The ever-present smell of volcanic ash and brimstone native to Nocturne appeared for a fleeting second, to be replaced by iron and phlegm. Steadying himself, he breathed the slow practiced breaths he was taught to manage the pain of a forge burn. A first, as his gene-enhanced constitution saw him impervious to any normal injury. Mastering his senses, he lifted up his enormous body to full height. He plucked the dagger out like a splinter. The wound immediately oozed a pale green dollop of bile. It reminded him of the custard inside a sweet pastry, and the thought made his stomach churn. Something was definitely wrong. He did not get sick. Turning his focus to his surroundings, he found himself in the middle of a cave, a base of operations seemingly constructed around the warp gate to his back, with hallways which looked like they entered deeper into the mountain. The mouth of the cave's entrance shimmered. He picked up a tool from a bench and threw it through. The tool shimmered and passed. A pang of pain threatening his stability shot through him. Another deep breath stowed it. He looked back at the warp gate and the materials around him. A few moments of looking around and barely avoiding traps left in wait by the sadistic Eldar, he found a few weapon caches. To a small note of surprise, he instinctively knew how they worked. He placed a few of the Eldar's version of melt-a-bombs around the base and the rest around the warp gate. He found a store of vehicles and was able to bring an Eldar jet bike to the mouth of the cave before convulsing with pain. It was getting worse, and he needed to get help quickly. He prepared the bike, then ran to set the melta-charges. Rushing back, he heard the thrum of the warp gate powering up. Hoping that he set the charges with a short enough fuse, he got on the jet bike and flew off. The sound of metal tearing into stone was the last thing he heard before the warble as he passed through the cave's projection. He immediately knew where he was. Skowrock, the Dragon Spire. Before he got 2 kilometers away, the mountain erupted behind him. The side of the mountain, seemingly vomiting fire apropos of nothing. It was not long before a scout unit of Planetary Defense Force came flying overhead. Their augur sensed that it was not volcanic activity and sent a few bodies to see in person. About to shoot him down, the crew stopped at the last second when they noticed the unmistakable figure of the pilot. Scrambling, they immediately stopped to pick him up and contacted the salamanders. It took both men on board to drag the Primarch onto the craft. By the time they reached the Dragon Spire, a Stormbird was waiting for their Primarch. The Marines and the Stormbird were aghast at the state of their father. The apothecary swallowed his dismay and immediately began working on Vulcan and shouted to the pilot.
There's little I can do here. We need to take them to Mount Deathfire immediately. It is the most advanced Medicaid facility outside of Prometheus and the Flame Rot.
Leaving that Vulcan would not make it to either location unsaid. Vulcan, influenced by his turbulent arrival on the planet, was wise enough to install Medicaid facilities in the major locations of interest around Nocturne. Mount Deathfire had the most advanced facilities, due to the danger to both the aspirants who trained there and even the Marines who tested them. The 7 major cities also benefited greatly from the facilities, as plagues of septic sweats ran rampant through them on regular intervals. The Primarch's condition only got worse on the trip, despite the apothecary's best efforts. Violent convulsions and delirium racked his body. They arrived at the facility and worked on him for 3 weeks, only slowing his rapid deterioration. His skin began to fissure, leaving rivers of green ichor-like blood to run between the cracks of his flesh. Occasionally, Vulcan would spasm, replying to unseen voices, denying them again and again, but less vehemently over time. The apothecaries found that the very same healing mechanisms that kept him alive were working in tandem with the virus to spread it throughout his body, as if the pathogen was specifically designed to kill a Primarch. Running out of time and options, they resolved to put Vulcan in stasis and bring him to his father. To their horror, Vulcan refused and forced himself up through screams of agony. Delirious and on the edge of madness, he ordered to be brought to a land speeder. Despite their vehement protestations, he took off. Wild-eyed with lucidity willed through pain, he brought himself to the edge of a massive pool of magma, which resembled a sea more than a lava flow. Vulcan looked down, blinking the rotten blood from his eyes. The wound on his chest had quadrupled in size, and the visible flesh had become so necrotic that its color blended into the skin around it. Pain so intense it would make an Astartes go numb with shock threatened to overtake him. He stared into the flow. Somehow he knew that stasis would not stop the voice. He tried to breathe, but the pus filling his lungs choked him. Falling to his knees, his eyes rolled back, and a vision of what could be overtook him. He saw worlds virulent with life. Oceans of maggots, swamps of human filth, bodies all over, the living and dead indistinguishable. A cancer world of endless growth, terraformed by machines. Machines of his mark. He saw a legion of wyverns on a previously pristine agri world. They spread gouts of fluid instead of flame, corrupting all in the pursuit of love. His love. He saw himself dying in agony and coming back to life, only to die again, over and over. He saw centuries of this until he saw himself break. His body, gray and ashy, awakes with a wicked, crooked smile. His love buried so deep under the hurt, the pain of helplessness, finally let loose and warped. His love for his legion, his love for humanity, most importantly, his love for his grandfather. A name became clear. Nurgle, his true father. The thought shook him, wavered him. A competing vision of this Nurgle, his father the Emperor, and Nabel fought in his mind. The violence of it all left his skull throbbing, blood filling his mouth. He couldn't take it anymore. Eyes shot open, and a scream heard for kilometers around rang out before Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders, cast himself into the magma. His flesh, layer by layer, burnt off until all that was left was his core, regenerating as fast as it was destroyed. There was clarity in this all-consuming pain, and the voice finally faded. Vulkan was gone for 7 days, and at the end of the 8th day, the Primarch rode back to the Medicae facility on the remains of a half-melted landspeeder. Cries of "Vulkan lives!" in exultation ran throughout the Legion at the news of his return, but those who met him there only felt dread. His flesh was encased in thick layers of still-burning magma. While cognizant, he was perpetually on the edge of snapping at the slightest break of his concentration. The first Marine to die was an apothecary trying to remove some of the magma from Vulkan's shoulders. In a fit of madness, he swung around and planted his fist within his helmetless face. Stuck, he flicked out his fingers to remove his hand, dropping the Marine backwards. Stunned, the Astartes took a second to react to his command to fetch flamers. That was when the second Marine died. Howling, Vulkan rushed the one closest to him, punching through ceramite and puncturing through his black carapace. Vulkan screamed in his face as he crushed both of his hearts in his hand. The Marines did as they were bade, and gathered 3 of them. He ordered them to hit him with a gout. Following without hesitation, they let loose. After a moment, Vulkan stood burning. He looked out, a calmness on his face, before the rage seeped its way back. He ordered them to follow him to the forge on base. There is where he worked on the first version of his armor, all the while his sons occasionally doused him in flame. He donned the pitch-black armor, and when the power pack connected, he ignited. Flames lashed at him, searing away flesh. His healing, like a muscle, grew stronger with time, growing his flesh back at a cancerous rate to match the constant conflagration. Eventually, he boarded the flame rod. None dared speak lest his flaming gaze burn through them. The love and brilliance that shone behind coal-red eyes was gone. He ordered to be brought to his father, sat in his seat on the bridge, and cooked as he gazed out into the infinite night. Rage of endless pain, the price of lucidity. At Vulkan's core, a sickness lay dormant, cowed by flames for the moment. 2 chaos gods war over the spoils, the soul of the sole perpetual Primarch. In the meantime, they must each find new champions, their fallbacks both set deep in ice and darkness. The unfortunate fate of many in The Warp.